Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We'll take a couple of minutes to let everyone into the room. In the meantime, if you want to put in the chat where you're from, we'd love to see who's joining the webinars. And also, if you are looking for Spanish translation, please go to the bottom of your screen and look for the globe. And that's where you can click in for English to Spanish translation. Miguel, do you want to share that in Spanish?
Sí, por supuesto. Muchas gracias a todos los que nos están acompañando.
Thank you, everyone who is joining today. We're going to talk about plastic pollution today. So as people continue to join, we want to let you know that most of the presentation will take place in English. So if you speak Spanish, you can find the interpretation available in the lower part of your screen. There is an icon that looks like a globe, and if you click on that icon, you can select Spanish to listen to the translation to Spanish.
Durante toda la transmisión. También, por favor, puede escribir sus preguntas en español en nuestro chat.
Also, feel free to write your questions in the chat. You can write them in Spanish. And we also would love to know where you're logging in from. You can also leave your contact details so we can keep in touch. Thank you.
All right, thanks. We have a lot of new people in, so welcome again to our plastic pollution webinar. We're going to give people a chance to get into the room, but we like it. We love seeing where you're from. We've got people from Canada, from Virginia, Black Canyon Audubon from down the road in Colorado, Missouri, East Washington, Texas, Seattle, Alberta, Guatemala, Jalisco. Thanks everybody for joining. And we gave some instructions before, but we'll give them again. So if you have any questions during the talks, you can put them in the chat. Please mute yourselves.
Pedimos a todos los participantes por favor estar pendiente de los micrófonos.
Please mute your microphone throughout the presentations. Thank you.
Monitoreando el chat para que
we will be paying attention to the chat. So you can write your comments there, and those of you who speak Spanish, you can find the translation channel where you can hear the translation to Spanish for the entire presentation. You can find it in the globe icon that is in the lower part of your screen. You can select the Spanish channel for Spanish language. Thank you.
Thanks for that reminder. We don't want to forget Claudia, who is our translator on our webinars, so we really appreciate her help with this. And if you are a Spanish speaker or want to listen in Spanish and practice your Spanish, you can go to the globe at the bottom and select that for the Spanish translation. Okay, we still have quite a few people coming in, so let's let it go for just another minute, Miguel, and then we'll get started so we don't have to repeat, so people aren't lost in the middle of this. But again, for those of you who are just coming in, if you can put in the chat box where you're from. We love seeing where you're coming from. We've got people from Canada to Guatemala to Mexico. I haven't been able to keep up with it, actually. It's going so fast. But love seeing where you're from, and thank you for joining us for the plastic pollution webinar. You'll be able to put your questions in the chat, but the questions will come at the end of the session, so you might want to hold off a little bit so we don't lose your question amongst the chats. Okay, I think we're slowing down a little bit. It's 3 after. I love seeing returnees too. So thanks to those of you who have been coming back again, or some of you I noticed, I don't know if I know you from doing Migratory Bird Day or other activities, but it's good to see you in the room. Okay, we're going to go on and get started then. I think it's about time, and we've got some great talks, so I want to make sure that everyone has enough time. But thank you. Welcome to our continued webinar series. We took a month off. So we're coming into the fall peak day of World Migratory Bird Day, and we're excited to have you back as we do our World Migratory Bird Day 2025 theme of shared spaces, creating bird-friendly cities and communities. So what's next is in September, on September 18th, same time, we'll have a program on light pollution. We look forward to having you for that. We'll have a panel again. And then in October, we're going to do a series of discussions on how to implement policies that protect birds, followed by November 20th, when we'll have our big celebration to conclude our season of World Migratory Bird Day 2025. And to announce to you the 2026 theme, which we're very excited about. So we hope you're able to join us for that as well. Environment for the Americas is an international organization. We work from Canada to Argentina and the Caribbean. Our team is located across the Western Hemisphere, and they're the ones who spread the word about World Migratory Bird Day, wherever you might live in those locations. We're also joined by partners around the world, including the Convention on Migratory Species, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, and the African Eurasian Water Bird Agreement. So we appreciate that global aspect of World Migratory Bird Day. World Migratory Bird Day and Environment for the Americas, of course, we share the same goals and passions. World Migratory Bird Day focuses on the conservation of migratory birds, but we also work to educate people and communities about migratory birds and their conservation, to inspire the next generation of conservationists. And we work to get out there and to motivate actions for conservation. When we do Migratory Bird Day, we're supporting bird conservation education in schools, museums, national parks, state parks, biosphere reserves, so many different locations, zoos. These groups are the groups that come to the general public and introduce the topic of birds, what migration is, the factors that impact migratory birds, and what people can do at home and in their communities to help birds. We provide all of these materials that groups need so that they can help their communities learn more about birds, from the fun things that kids like to do, to the educational print materials, to online products and other aspects of the program, such as this webinar that we make possible. And we're able to make that possible because of our sponsors and our partners. These are the partners who help us fund those needs. We really appreciate their support, especially the support over the years, which helps us to continue to grow the number of resources that we can provide communities across the Western Hemisphere and around the world. If you're interested in getting involved and being a supporter, you can do that. We would love to see you take part in World Migratory Bird Day by sponsoring a webinar. You can sponsor our Spanish translation, provide a happy kit to a community. You can pick your country or your state, or donating a flight. We have a lot of need for getting people around to meetings and conservation activities. So if you have extra airline miles, please let us know. We can always put those to extremely good use. And World Migratory Bird Day, if you're not familiar with it, but it was started in 1993. I'm sorry, 1993, and it's continued. Environment for the Americas took over its organization in the early 2000s. So beginning in 2000 was our first theme approach to the program, and you can see that we've addressed a number of critical topics related to bird conservation, from the power of partnerships to the impacts of plastic pollution, which we have actually focused on before, to the critical need for restoring habitat and protecting habitat, the importance of stopover sites to migratory birds, and of course, the need to protect insects for the 95% of migratory species that depend on them throughout their life cycle. So this year, we're very excited to have the theme of shared spaces. The artist, Ana Maria Savarina, created a beautiful piece of art that reflects our theme this year. And one of the things I love the most about this art is that tucked away in every corner of it are different ways that you can help birds. So there are actually 7 actions, from the cat behind the window to the light in the background. So if you want to look at that at some point during the meeting or afterwards, it's a fun way to use it as a teaching tool, and as a reminder to the many ways that we can help support bird conservation. So to get us started, and I'm so excited about our topic today. It's been one that, as I said, we focused on for an entire year, but it continues to be a threat to birds. And we're excited to bring 3 experts to the table today to discuss plastic pollution. We have Peter Stoett from the Ontario Tech University in Canada, Mark Botton from Fordham University, and Daana Kanhai from the University of the West Indies. Our format will be that each presenter will speak, and we'll wait until the end of all of their talks for questions. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll deliver them to our speakers at the end. And then following that, we did have our photography competition again. And so I'll announce the plastic pollution competition winners before we conclude the program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Stoett from Ontario Tech University in Canada. Peter has just attended some meetings on plastic pollution. We're excited that he's part of the IUCN and some of the discussions that are going on about plastics at the global level. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Susan. And as someone who works with invasive species policy, I'm really happy to see the cat behind the window in your poster. That's a nice touch. So we can begin the presentation if you'd like. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the problem from a global perspective. I suspect most people on this call are aware that plastic pollution is a major threat to biodiversity and human health, but it never hurts to reiterate these facts. So we can move on then. So plastic, basically invented around 1907, synthetic material made from a wide range of organic polymers that can be molded into shape while soft and then set in a rigid or slightly elastic form. This is a standard definition. Very important to note that around 98% of plastic is derived from fossil fuel production. It is known as a byproduct, basically. There are over 10,000 different chemical additives involved in the process of making plastic, and roughly 2,400 have been flagged as potentially concerning for persistence, bioaccumulation, or toxicity. We'll hear more about bioaccumulation in our next presentation, I believe, but it's of course a very serious issue for birds, given their space on the food chain. We make an awful lot of plastic globally, right? It's ubiquitous. It's part of the economy. I'm sure everyone, wherever they're sitting, can look around them now and see multiple objects made of some form of plastic. Even when you drive a car these days, the tires are made from synthetic rubber, which contain polymers and so forth. 400 million tons a year produced globally. Predictions are that this will increase, if we go at the current rate, by around 70% by 2040 and could triple by 2060. And of course, this is terrifying because we know that the plastic that's in the environment right now is causing so many problems. And this is partly, at least, a result of the fact that around 10% of global production of plastic is properly recycled. Right? The vast majority of it's not. Now, a lot of it stays in inanimate objects that we keep in our houses or what have you. Right? So it's not, the rest of that's not all going right out into the environment. Right? But a good deal of it is, and it's hard to get a grip on just how much. We have found plastic waste, scientists investigating this in the deep sea, in fish, in birds, in air, in rain, Arctic and Antarctic ice, human placenta, brains, and reproductive systems. In fact, it's hard. It's probably going to be, we're reaching a point where it's more difficult to find a place where there's no plastic than there is. It's particularly hit marine systems hard, though. right? And that includes not just the oceans, but lakes as well. Right? And of course, many birds are reliant on freshwater and marine systems. Yeah, I'll move a little faster if you like. Susan, please. There's three types of plastic waste we're most concerned. Microplastic, that's the stuff you can basically see. Those are the bottles, cigarette butts, styrofoam, fishing gear, of course, a major source of this. Microplastic, there's two types there. One is primary. This is the plastics that's used to make other plastic material, right? So these are very small nurdles and microbeads, many of which are lost in production or transportation. Every now and then you'll hear about a ship that goes to ground or ends up sinking, which is full of plastic nurdles that have been transported from one place to the other. And the release, of course, is tremendous. But the biggest concern is the day-to-day releases involved in these primary. Most microbeads have been banned in most places now, thankfully. So you'll no longer find them in cleaning products like they used to be in shampoo and so forth. But it's still an issue. Secondary microplastic, though, is the bigger problem. And this is when the macroplastic breaks down with exposure to the sun and oxygen and so on. This is what we call broken down macro polyester fibers as well that come off when you wash your clothes. I mentioned car tires before. When you drive your car, pieces are getting basically lost each time. Then there's nanoplastic, which is when basically microplastic breaks down. These are even smaller pieces, which you cannot see with the human eye, much smaller particles. And that's the biggest concern I think that most scientists have today with its impact on biodiversity, because it can pass through biological membranes. So when we talk about it getting into the human brain, for example, that's not actual plastic going up there as we conceive of it. It's tiny, tiny, but it's definitely there. And then don't forget toxic chemicals. Toxic chemicals go into this process. They are released when the microplastic breaks down, okay, or when macroplastic, breaks down. But they are also attracted to this plastic as well. Some of them naturally are attracted to it. Important to keep in mind that plastic and climate change are related. First of all, again, around 10% of all fossil fuels goes to plastic production. That alone, of course, entails a tremendous release of greenhouse gas emissions. Recycling and burning plastic waste releases greenhouse gas emissions. Gases are released in the breakdown process. And here's what's particularly concerning for people that work in microbiology and other areas to do with marine systems in particular. Microzooplankton and zooplankton, which are the basis of the ocean food chain, basically. The concern there is that they can ingest nanoplastics, and that this can harm their digestive systems, which in turn reduces their ability to absorb carbon, on which we rely, right? So we'll keep moving. This is also a human rights issue. This is something I always like to stress. Human rights and security are harmed all along the life cycle of plastic products, from extraction to consumption to the discard of plastics, particularly the latter, because many can argue that illegal and legal plastic waste is often dumped in low-income countries and areas. And in many cases, of course, it's not disposed of properly, it's burned, right? Especially the illegal plastic trade. And this results in serious damage to the respiratory system. It can harm childhood development. There's all sorts of problems associated with this. The majority of the world sent its plastic waste to China until around 2017, when China decided to ban its importation. And that has created a sort of knock-on effect, right? Where the European Union, for example, now sends more plastic waste to Turkey. In many cases, it's not being sent anymore, but it's still not being disposed of properly. And in some cases, it has moved to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and others that are starting to import the waste. And arguably, of course, as in any climate issue, the rights of future generations, the rights of nature, also violated by this continued plastic production and pollution, this unrivaled in history level of production, I'll put it that way. Next. So this problem and birds really intimately connected. Arguably, photos like this, very graphic, 2009, Chris Jordan went and did a photo essay on Midway Island in the Pacific, right? An area I've just returned from, actually. I was out there and saw quite a bit of plastic pollution myself. This is an albatross chick that has obviously swallowed all sorts of plastic objects, right? Which led to, as you can see, its starvation. This photo really went around the globe back then. I know it inspired myself, even, and many of my students to get involved in this issue and take it more seriously. Again, it's more the nano and microplastic that we're worried about than this sort of thing, but this is really important, I think, as an important moment, if you will, in the recognition of the problem. Next. And it's resulted even in some unfortunate new words, as I call it. Plasticosis, this is something that's recently come up. Plastic-induced fibrosis in wild animals scars the digestive tract of birds. Okay, this is incredible, right? The scientific community is actually inventing new words to discuss on to describe, sorry, the damage that plastic is doing to birds and other species. And then there's a term called the plastisphere that you might have heard of, which is the suggestion that there's a whole new layer of life or ecosystems living on plastic debris, which can include pathogens and invasive species, by the way, particularly in some of the more pronounced plastic gathering zones, such as the gyres in the Pacific Ocean. Next. Yeah, so there's various conventions that try and deal with this problem. I mentioned some of them here. None of them have managed to stop the problem, obviously. You can argue that if these conventions were applied properly, it might have more effect. But right now, clearly, the problem has not been unabated because there's been many, many countries that have passed great legislation at both the national and regional or state or provincial level. Or even at the city level. So I'm not suggesting by any means nothing's been done. A lot has been done. But the evidence suggests that it's not enough, right? The UN Environment Assembly mandated the creation of a plastics treaty in March 2022. And we've had negotiations since then in Uruguay, France, Kenya, Canada, South Korea, and most recently Geneva. And the goal is an enforceable treaty that controls both production and pollution, although some would interpret the goal slightly differently. Next. The most recent round of negotiations were in Geneva, and this is where many of my colleagues and I have been going back and forth and reporting on. There was immense pressure to conclude these negotiations there. There was some hope that this would happen, although frankly, many of us didn't have too much hope. But it would be nice to have an international treaty on this that could actually limit the production of plastic, right? But this became a very much the sticking point. There are some countries that, and I mentioned some here, the countries that are heavily involved in oil production, as you can imagine, that simply refuse to accept the idea that a treaty can limit the production of plastic, right? Everyone supports dealing with plastic pollution and trying to limit that in terms of increasing recycling and so on. But it's the question of capping the production that is the real sticking point, and the monitoring of toxic chemicals involved in the process as well. Now, many of my colleagues would argue, and you can just go to the next slide because I want to show that. I think I've got this where I've got this. Yeah. Many of my colleagues would argue that, look, having a weak treaty that doesn't control production in any form is worse than having no treaty, right? And you can also argue that there's been quite a bit of advancement made over these years that we've been negotiating this this treaty. First of all, there's been global recognition of the problem. There's been an explicit connection made, because the evidence is so strong, I don't think it's deniable, but nonetheless, between plastic pollution and human health, right? That this is a threat to human health globally, but especially when it comes to certain, as I mentioned before, disadvantaged populations. There's a recognition that there's a need for a science policy interface right? That we need to continue in this manner, that science has to influence policy. There's been this open discussion of a just transition because so many people are dependent, by some estimates, 20 million people are dependent on picking plastic waste for their living, right? But they also, of course, do a service by helping to keep the certain areas clean. We need to think about how they can transition out of those positions in a socially just way. There's a need to control the plastic waste trade. This has been officially recognized and formally recognized by corporations and states, by the way. Many corporations have been very adamantly in favor of a strong treaty to do this. And there has been what I call limited but effectual Indigenous community participation. What I mean by that is Indigenous people have been at these conferences. They've been giving presentations. They hold side events. I don't want to exaggerate that, right? But they've been there. And so it's limited, but I think it's effectual because to hear them talk about what plastic pollution and toxic chemicals are doing to their communities is very moving, of course. I think the last slide then, if it's not, or close to the last slide. Have we lost Susan? Okay. I'm part of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. We've been involved in the process for the past 4 years, basically. This is a photo of some of us in Ottawa when we were brainstorming to try and move to try and influence countries in terms of how they vote and think about the extent of plastic pollution that we're dealing with today. And I think I just have one more slide, which is, this is what an albatross is supposed to look like, by the way, as opposed to the other one we saw. Just a couple of resources here, including the Scientist Coalition. Please check us out if you'd like. Earth Negotiations Bulletin is an excellent source of factual information on how the plastic treaty negotiations went. And so I offer that for you as well. And thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I'm going to address one issue that I saw in the chat to make sure everyone understands where the slides are. For those of you who aren't seeing the slides, please go to the top of your Zoom screen. There are 2 tabs up there. One says meeting, and it has a little image of a bunch of people, and the other says environment for the Americas. Please click on the one that says environment for the Americas so that you'll see the slides. I know that's a sneaky little thing that Zoom added to it. But thank you so much, Peter, for updating us on what's been happening in the world of plastics. We appreciate that and appreciate your being such an important part of the efforts to reduce plastic use. I want to introduce Mark Botton from Fordham University. Mark is a professor emeritus with a focus on marine conservation. And so looking forward very much, Mark, to hear what you have to say about plastic pollution and how it moves up through our food chain.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to everyone who's attending, and thanks to Peter for giving such a great overview and introduction. I'm going to focus sort of on a very narrow piece of the story, which is the movement of microplastics in a food chain on the east coast of the U.S. Now, I noticed a lot of the participants are not from the East Coast, which is the only place in North America where we have horseshoe crabs. These animals spawn on sandy beaches and lay eggs. Here's a cluster of eggs here. And the linkage between horseshoe crabs, their eggs, and shorebirds is an important phenomenon, particularly in the parts of Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. So I'm going to give a fairly specific project that we did showing the movement of microplastics in this part of the food chain. Next, please. So no surprise, plastics are pretty much everywhere. Operationally, microplastics are usually defined by size as entities less than 5 millimeters in size, and the nanoplastics are even orders of magnitude smaller than those. So the abundant litter that you see on the beach, while unsightly, is not really the part of the story that I'm focused on. Next, please. Uh, the field of marine microplastics has grown exponentially. Uh, I did a quick Google Scholar search using the search term marine microplastics, and you can see the number of publications in the scientific literature has just been growing exponentially, and shows no sign of slowing down. Next slide. So as I mentioned, horseshoe crab eggs are an important food for shorebirds on East Coast stopovers. Here's animals spawning eggs that get washed out of the sediment by wave action or the digging activities of the crabs, make for a readily available food source. Now, many of these shorebirds that we're talking about, such as the red knots that you see sort of in the background and the ruddy turnstones that you see in the foreground, these animals breed in the Arctic, but overwinter in South America. And stopover sites such as Delaware Bay and Jamaica Bay are important places for these birds to refuel and gain weight in order to complete the next leg of the journey up to the Arctic for breeding. Next slide. Now, our particular study site is in New York City, a location known as Jamaica Bay, which is a obviously highly urbanized location surrounded by the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens. So we have three main research objectives that I'd like to briefly describe. Firstly, how prevalent are the microplastics in horseshoe crab eggs from Jamaica Bay? And we also asked whether these microplastics are incorporated in the egg as the eggs are being formed by the females, or potentially through the contact with the beach sediments in which they're deposited. And we also wanted to explore the relationship between horseshoe crab eggs and the incorporation of microplastics into the shorebirds in Jamaica Bay. Next. So the first part of this study, I credit to my student, Royal McMahon Ward. We collected horseshoe crab eggs in two ways. First, directly from the females. These are eggs that are being extruded from the female, which we can collect, and then the ones that are deposited in the sediment after they've been fertilized. Next slide, please. And then another student, Emily Casper, collected the shorebird fecal pellets. She was sitting in a blind where the birds could forage, and after the birds left the area, she would go out and collect the fecal pellet samples, which under a microscope are these dark structures here, surrounded by a bunch of sand grains, but these are the fecal pellets. Next slide. One of the things that Emily found, not surprisingly, is that the shorebirds concentrate their feeding on horseshoe crab eggs as the eggs become more abundant. So early in the season, early in May, most of the fecal pellet samples do not contain horseshoe crab eggs, and then as the spawning of the crabs commences in mid-May and late May, the eggs become more abundant, and the birds flip over and really focus their foraging almost exclusively on horseshoe crab eggs. Next, please. So what we did in this study was to take the horseshoe crab egg and fecal pellet samples, process them in a number of ways that I won't bother describing. I can mention that later if people are interested. And then stain the samples using a dye called Nile red, which under fluorescence microscopy, all the microplastic particles will glow a green color. So here are some examples of the kinds of things that we found, these small roundish particles, and then microfibers, as you see here. Next slide. So what we found was that there are a significant number of microplastic particles in horseshoe crab eggs, both fertilized and unfertilized eggs. These are numbers of particles per gram of horseshoe crab eggs. Some in shorebird fecal pellets, not as much in the sand or in the ambient water. Next slide. So then we wanted to ask a question about what does this mean in terms of the ingestion of microplastics by the foraging shorebirds. So these are some back of the envelope approximations. So we said, okay, there were some differences between the microplastic counts in the fertilized and unfertilized eggs, but we just sort of averaged those and said, okay, it's roughly 600 microplastics per gram of crab eggs. Next. Now we know how many horseshoe crab eggs there are in a gram from a previous study. So there's a little more than 100 eggs to make up 1 gram. Next. So we then, simple math, we take the eggs, divide the microplastics in a gram by the number of eggs per gram. So there's a little more than 6 microplastic particles in each horseshoe crab egg. Follow that with an estimate of ingestion in the next slide. This is not our work, but are from literature values. Now, these numbers seem extraordinary. Birds eating 8,000 to 18,000 horseshoe crab eggs per day. But if you ever watch these shorebirds while they're foraging, they're just taking one peck after another, seemingly, even to the exclusion of any other activity once they find a good patch of eggs. So although these numbers seem extraordinary, they've been pretty well documented. So next slide. We kind of put all the wheels in motion and we say, given this ingestion rate and given the number of microplastics per egg, we're talking about potentially a shorebird eating over 50,000 of these microplastic particles each day. And they tend to remain foraging on the beach for about a 2 to 3 week period before they continue the migration up to the Arctic. So that's potentially, again, a very large amount of microplastics that birds could eat if they're concentrating their foraging, as we suspect, on the crab eggs. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of I shouldn't say warnings, but caveats here. The ingestion rates that I mentioned, the 8,000 plus per day, are based on shorebirds feeding in Delaware Bay, which is known to have a higher concentration of crab eggs than Jamaica Bay. So the ingestion rates in Jamaica Bay could be lower, but probably at least on the same order of magnitude. We also don't know whether microplastics in Delaware Bay horseshoe crab eggs are as abundant as microplastics in Jamaica Bay. Jamaica Bay is a much more urban location. Delaware Bay, somewhat more pristine, so perhaps in Delaware Bay, the number of microplastics per egg is different. We would need to do further studies on that. And we also know that shorebirds eat things other than horseshoe crab eggs. As I pointed out in that one slide, early in the season, the shorebirds are foraging on other kinds of invertebrates. We don't know whether or not those alternative food items contain microplastics. My guess is that they probably do, seeing as just about everything in the marine environment does seem to contain microplastics. Next slide. So a couple of other things just to throw in as areas for further research, really. The slide I showed, the bar graph, mentioned that there were fewer microplastics in the shorebird fecal pellets compared to the eggs, and that raises the question about how many of those eggs that are ingested, or how many of the microplastics in the eggs become incorporated into the tissue of the birds. We don't know that yet. And perhaps the bottom line thing that we really don't have a good feel for is, are there adverse effects of these microplastic ingestions on the shorebirds, or for that matter, are there any adverse effects of the microplastics on the horseshoe crab eggs themselves? That's an open area for future research. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we did find microplastics in all the samples of horseshoe crab eggs and shorebird fecal pellets from Jamaica Bay. Clearly, the microplastics are capable of transferring from the body of the females to their eggs during the formation of the eggs. And because spring migrant shorebirds concentrate their foraging on horseshoe crab eggs, there is a potential to ingest large quantities of microplastics with as yet undetermined effects on the health of those shorebirds. So let me wrap this up with one last slide. And this is simply an acknowledgement to the two students who did the project, Emily Casper on the left, Royal McMahon Ward in the center, and the slide and the appreciation to the granting agencies and the agencies that gave us the necessary permits to do the field work in Jamaica Bay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. That's an incredible study, and I'm sure we just don't think about microplastics moving their way up the food chain through the eggs of another organism and then into the systems of birds. So that's really critical work. Thank you so much. Again, if you have questions, we'll be taking them after the next talk. And we're so pleased to have with us today Dr. Daana Kanhai from the University of the West Indies. Daana is joining us from Trinidad and Tobago and will be sharing her work and the experiences of her island. So thank you so much, Daana.
Thanks very much, Susan. Just confirming that you all can hear me properly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Warm greetings from the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. And in the next couple of minutes, all I'm going to do is really share my journey with you. Just as these beloved migratory birds make a journey from one point of the globe to another, I'm going to share my journey with you as it relates to the issue of plastic pollution. So in 2015, I had this opportunity to head to Europe to start a PhD on microplastics in the ocean. And I had the opportunity to go on 2 expeditions, one in the Atlantic Ocean and another in the Arctic Ocean. And at that time, my focus was really on microplastics. So as you've heard the speakers before me, they've said that microplastics are these particles that are less than 5 millimeters in diameter. And what we had done on both of those expeditions was that we sampled surface waters, subsurface waters, we sampled sediments in the Arctic Ocean. We were able to sample the sea ice. And if you can see on the next slide, you would realize that in every single environmental compartment that we had sampled in, we were finding these particles. And to many persons, you would think, well, the Arctic Ocean is this seemingly pristine location, it's far removed from, human activities, but yet still we were finding microplastics in this area. Now in 2025, it's acknowledged that microplastics are ubiquitous. They're seemingly everywhere. And so that was really a cause for concern, the fact that you had these particles and they were present in almost every environmental compartment. Now, when I completed my PhD in 2018, I decided that I wanted to bring what I had learned back to the Caribbean region. And so if you take a look at the next slide and you look at the Caribbean large marine ecosystem, you would realize that this is a region that has oceanic currents that are bringing waters to the Caribbean region. It's causing water to circulate within the region, and then it's causing seawater to head to the adjacent Gulf of Mexico large marine ecosystem. So there's a lot of seawater that's being transported throughout the Caribbean region. But along with the seawater, you can also have the transport of plastics, right? And so in 2019, if you look on the next slide, that was the first time I had done work as it relates to microplastics in the Caribbean Sea. I was able to join leg 4 of Expedition's voyage in the Caribbean Sea. And we sailed at that time from Antigua to Bonnet. It was a really beautiful expedition, definitely warmer conditions than the Arctic Ocean. But we did quite similar things. We looked at microplastics in different environmental compartments. But the difference with this expedition was that we started linking what we had been finding as it relates to microplastics in the marine environment to what was happening on land. And so very often when we think of plastic pollution, it's a problem that originates on land. And if we don't have proper waste management on land, you can have some of those plastics leaking into the marine environment. The difference as well with Expedition was the connection to the various stakeholders that are operating on land. So who do we need to speak to? And the link with public education and awareness. So that was my first expedition back in the Caribbean. And then moving a little bit closer to home, if you look at the other slide, you would see this nice image of, well, before I head to Trinidad and Tobago, you would see one of the things that I also did in about 2019, 2020. So I was part of UNEP's Scientific Advisory Committee on Marine Litter and Microplastics. And just before the pandemic, we went to Kenya for a meeting. So that was in 2020, maybe about February 2020, February, March 2020. And while I was at that meeting, one of the questions, I can't remember who asked me, they said, you know, well, what's the state of knowledge about plastics in the Caribbean region? And at that time, I couldn't really answer the question. I said, well, I know a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago and some of the other islands, but I can't give you a proper answer. So when I came back to Trinidad and Tobago, you know, I reached out to my supervisor, Professor Judith Gobin at that time, and I said, look, this is something that we need to answer. And so what we did was that we did a very extensive literature review, and we looked at all the articles that had been published between 1980 to 2020 to try to understand what was known, what were the knowledge gaps, and how do we fill those knowledge gaps. And so what you would realize for the Caribbean region is that we know a lot about marine debris that's washing up on our shores. So the beaches, because they're easily accessible, persons can go there, you know, do these studies to try to figure out how much marine debris is there, how much marine litter is there. They also can take samples to analyze for microplastics. But from the time you start heading out into other environmental compartments and other ecosystems, things like mangroves, coral reefs, the deep sea, we started seeing that there were less studies. And that's really because you need more specialized equipment and vessels to be able to sample in those environmental compartments. What we also saw for the Caribbean region was that we had these long-term data sets. So from citizen science initiatives, such as the International Coastal Cleanup, we had long-term data sets from maybe about 1990 to now. And that really underscores the importance of citizen science initiatives. Within this region as well, you would notice that we understood that plastics had an impact, a negative impact on biodiversity, right? And if you take a look at the next slide, I think the image is a little bit bigger on the next slide, right? You would see that we've understood in this region that organisms are ingesting plastic. So I almost actually refused or declined to speak at this webinar because I said to myself, I'm not an expert in birds, right? And so that's why I put up that image there of the red-billed tropic bird. That was one of the only studies that we found between 1980 in peer-reviewed literature between 1980 to 2020 for this region, indicating that plastics were found in seabirds, right? Of course, there would be other gray literature that might have reported that, but this is one of the only studies that pointed it out. So organisms are ingesting plastics. Plastics are also entangling certain organisms, such as things like the sea turtles. And they also, in mangrove ecosystems, what we've noticed is that plastics in this region are smothering the roots of the black mangroves. So the pneumatophores, as well as the prop roots of the red mangroves. And that, of course, then has ecological effects for those mangrove ecosystems. Just this morning, we went out on a field visit and we tried to collect some Asian green mussel. So that's you're seeing in the third column there under ecological effects. But what plastics do is that once they're being transported from point A to point B via these oceanic currents, you can have organisms hitching a ride on the plastics. And so I think our first speaker, Peter, might have pointed out the potential for the introduction of invasive species as a result of plastics. And then, of course, you have chemical effects as well, which is where you have chemical contaminants that are being absorbed onto plastics. And so when you have organisms ingesting these plastics, they're not only ingesting the plastic, but as well, they are ingesting the chemical contaminants that are adsorbed these chemicals. So these were a couple of things that we had known about plastics and its impact, its negative impact on biodiversity in the region. And then, of course, moving a little bit now, I think, to the next slide, closer to home, Trinidad and Tobago. So you would see the same thing. For those that are unfamiliar with Trinidad and Tobago, we are the most southerly islands in the Caribbean. We are very close to the South American mainland, and those white arrows that you're seeing on the screen, those actually show you the direction of the oceanic currents. So just as I pointed out before, we have oceanic currents that are bringing plastics to our waters, causing it to be stranded on our coasts, and then water is circulating and heading off into the Caribbean Sea. This image on the screen is actually coming from this book that's about to be launched this afternoon, 60 Years of Independence, right? But some of the work, so if we switch to the next slide, one of the first things that I did as it relates to plastic pollution in Trinidad and Tobago is to try to understand the human dimension of the issue. So what I had done in about 2022 or thereabouts, is that I had reached out to some environmental psychologists in Europe, and we collaborated together on this study. We sent out this study to Trinbagonians, and we wanted to understand what were some of the factors. We often think that knowledge is the thing that's going to drive positive behavior, but we wanted to understand what were some of the things that were influencing people's use of single-use plastics. So some of the things we found were things like it's very convenient, and that's no surprise, right? But also another thing is that if it is that you are surrounded by people, family and friends that were using single-use plastics, a lot of single-use plastics, you are more likely to use single-use plastics. The opposite also was the case, whereby if you were surrounded by people who were not using a lot of single-use plastics, you would also be influenced to not use single-use plastics, right? We also tried to look at what were some of the things that influence people's support for policies on plastic pollution. So whether it was a ban on single-use plastics or some other policy. And we found that people who had lived in other countries where there were successful policies, they were more likely to support new policies locally. And then the last thing we looked at for that study was people's intention, of course, to reduce their plastic consumption. And we found that the people that were more likely to reduce their plastic consumption would have been people that spent time in nature. They visibly saw, or it could be two things. One, they enjoyed just being in nature and being in a location where it wasn't polluted, or it could have been that they actually saw the impacts of plastics on the beloved ecosystems that they enjoyed spending time in, whether those were beaches, mangrove ecosystems, and coral reefs. They were more likely to want to reduce their plastic consumption. And of course, knowledge was one of the things that we found that drove people's or increased people's intention to switch or to reduce their plastic consumption, right? And again, we have that factor of family and friends. So if you were in a circle of people that were trying to do something about the problem or trying to reduce their plastic consumption, you were more likely to do that, right? So that was one of the studies that we did. And you might say, well, what's the importance of that study? So that study is important when you're crafting interventions. So you might want to focus on small groups, build their knowledge and awareness about the impacts of plastics, try to get them to reduce their use of plastics. And then, of course, that has knock-on effects to their friends and their family network. You might also want to foster field trips and camps for younger children, and make sure that they are intimately, integrated with nature. So these are some of the reasons why studies like that are important. And then moving on to the next slide, some of the more recent work that we did focused on the issue of marine plastics. So very often we hear that, 80% of the plastics are coming from land-based sources, 20% coming from sea-based sources. But we really wanted to find out what's the situation for Trinidad and Tobago. And so here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have artisanal fishers that are using multiple gear types. So they're using gill nets, traps, hooks, and lines. And we really wanted to understand the problem. How much are they losing? Why are they losing it? And then use that information to inform interventions. How can we prevent? How can we mitigate? How might we remediate? Right. So that's an article that's going to come out pretty soon. It's under review at the minute. And then I think the last slide for my presentation is for the Caribbean region. I mentioned at the very beginning, we have some known knowledge gaps. And one of the knowledge gaps we have for our region is the impacts of plastics on marine organisms. And so right now, we're in the process of recruiting an MPhil student to work on a project that looks at establishing some sort of long-term monitoring for plastics in sea turtles, chemical contaminants in sea turtles, and then looking at the impacts of a change in climate on the diet of sea turtles. So this is some new work that'll be starting in 2026. But I just want to end here by thanking everyone for your time and attention. As I said before, I'm not an expert on birds, but happy to share my journey with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kanhai. We appreciate that presentation, and regardless of whether you feel like you're an expert on birds, the work that you're doing is so critical. So thank you so much. What I'm going to do at this time is I'm going to ask Dr. Stoett and Dr. Botton to put on their video cameras, and I'm going to bring you all on to help answer questions from the community here. And I notice there are already some questions in the chat box, so let me pull those up. One of the questions that I saw, and I didn't notice if it was answered, somebody was asking how they could sign on to become a member of the Scientist Coalition for the End of Plastics. Can anyone answer that question?
Yes, I can. So it's, first of all, it's the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. Okay, not for the end of plastics. That's a bit ambitious. And if you go to the website, which I can put back in the chat if you'd like, we are always looking for people, typically university professors, but others that are engaged in the area of plastic studies, to join us and get involved. So I'll put that in the chat, Susan.
Thank you so much. This is going to be a tough question. This comes from Ed Stiskel. And the question is the load, spread, and retention of microplastics already too advanced to solve? Who would like to take?
Yeah, I can say very quickly there's absolutely no way we are going to recover the plastic that's in the environment. It would be ludicrous to consider that. So, and this is why the emphasis has to be on as we say, turning off the tap, right, or limiting at least the the addition that we're seeing every year. But in terms of there are recovery projects that are ongoing, some of which, and there are, for example, fishermen have been hired and paid to retrieve macroplastics and so forth. There's been technological advances made on this, trying to use different types of machinery. But the very idea, as the other presentations I think have made it clear, plastic it's embedded in the seabed, it's in the digestive tracts of animals, it's bioaccumulating. I mean, there's just no way we're going to recover what's out there. That would be my take on it. Thanks.
I similarly think that what's there is there for in perpetuity, and what we have to do is think about reducing the new inputs of materials. So for example, I had some conversations with people on a matter of microfibers and how much of the microfiber load is coming from clothing. And there is technology, and it's being used in Japan, I'm not sure where else, which basically intercepts the microfibers before they get into the wastewater. I don't think that's enough. It's not going to get rid of what's already in the ocean, but it would prevent additional inputs of microplastics.
Thank you, Mark, Dr. Botton. Dr. Kanhai, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so of course we cannot retrieve all the plastics that's present in the ocean at the minute, but there might be some that we would like to retrieve. So for example, if you do have abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear, for example, gill nets, and you know they're located in a particular spot, you might want to retrieve those because they keep ghost fishing. So there might be some that you might want to target in the future. And that's what some of the studies working on ALD DFG have done. They've tried to ask fishers, well, do you know known areas where these types of gear are present in the water? And then you use that to inform interventions, meaning to retrieve those specific types of gear. Yeah.
Thank you. And from Juliana Navarro, we have the question, which this is a big one. To what extent do excessive human production and consumption, which generate microplastics, highlight not only an environmental crisis, but also an ethical crisis regarding our responsibility to nature and future generations?
From my perspective, it's quite clear. And many people have suggested this, that a couple hundred years from now, if the human race is still around, and we look back, we'll look at this from geological findings, etc., as the age of plastic. I mean, it's a big part of the Anthropocene, as we call it, and we have an ethical obligation, absolutely, I think, to avoid further pollution. And please keep in mind, it's not just the plastic that's out there, it's the chemicals that are used to make it as well, right? And as Dr. Botton suggested, we still don't know the impacts of this. So there is an ethical obligation, which we refer to as the precautionary principle, which suggests, and every country has accepted this in terms of the, signing on to a treaty in 1992. That suggests that you should not take chances, basically, right? You should know what you're doing before you go out and do it. And we haven't done that, I think, with many of these chemicals and/or with excessive plastic production. I'd also like to add, there's an obligation, I believe, also that the people that are most affected by plastic pollution should be compensated in some manner. And that's a big ask. I understand that. But for example, Dr. Kanhai mentioned fishermen that can go out and retrieve fishing gear. And so many fishermen now are out of jobs because of overfishing, but also things like plastic pollution that are hurting their fishing opportunities. This just transition that I mentioned earlier, we've got to rethink these means of livelihood. And one way to rethink it might be owing them an obligation to help us clean this mess up, is paying them for doing that. So I just throw that out there as well. But
Thank you.
Add one thought here that at least in the area that we've done this study, Jamaica Bay, there are a lot of efforts to engage citizens in beach cleanups and other activities, including horseshoe crab tagging and so forth. So getting young people particularly, but all citizens who have a stake in their environment, getting them to participate and learn about the environment. I mean, a lot of people, because it's such an urban location, don't realize what a wonderfully diverse habitat it is. We have, I think, something like 250 species of birds that reside in Jamaica Bay. So it's a great opportunity to get local schools and others involved and tell them about the importance of maintaining a clean marine environment.
Thank you, Dr. Botton. Dr. Kanhai, would you like to comment?
So I definitely agree that when we're speaking about the issue of plastic pollution, we need to think about, future generations to come. And I saw that one panelist is asking, what keeps you hopeful about this negative topic? It's the future generations and the young people that keep me, most hopeful that things can improve, that action can be taken. So those are things that keep me hopeful about this negative topic.
Thank you. We have more questions in the chat, but I know we are over our time. So I want to do this. I just want to end and have each one of you maybe share one thing you would recommend that everyone could do to help reduce plastic pollution. And I'll reverse the order this time, and I'll start with you, Dr. Kanhai.
Yes, so one thing I would say that wherever you are, whatever is your circle, that is where you should take action. I don't know how many scientists we have here, how many persons we have that are mothers or teachers, but that's where you should target your efforts. If you can influence one person or one small group of people, that will have the knock-on effects, whether it is to switch from using single-use plastics, whether it is to take action on a scientific project, get your kids outdoors, that sort of thing. I think all those small actions can actually have ripple effects, really big ripple effects.
Yeah, I like that. Like when they say, what's it going to do if I don't use a plastic straw? And they say, well, says 1 billion people, or, how many straws is that? Dr. Botton, what would you say?
Yeah. I think there are ways that people could reduce single-use plastics that are not going to cost them any money and would actually save them money. It's been said that the manufacturers of bottled water aren't selling water, they're selling plastic bottles. And it would be more cost effective for people to install, we have these relatively inexpensive filtration systems that you can fill your water bottle and use repeatedly instead of buying case after case of these non-recyclable plastic bottles.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dr. Stoett?
Well, there's so many things that can be done on the individual level, and the ripple effect is wonderful. So I don't want to discourage any of that, right? But I do want to stress that this is actually a macro problem. that plastic production is very much seen in the future of the fossil fuel industry, right? Especially as we adopt other energy sources. And this is why I think the pressure on governments has to remain strong, right? So if you can go out to protests, if you can write your representatives, depending on the political system in which you live. I know we have a varied audience here, but don't overlook that need to get governments as engaged as they can in pursuing, as most countries were, the vast majority of countries wanted a strong plastics treaty. We shouldn't forget that. It was a very small group that pushed against it. And we need to change their minds as well. So keep the overall political perspective, please, in mind, the global perspective as well. Yeah, I love the ripple effect. So, everything good starts at home, right? One way or the other. So let's start there. Yeah.
Well, a big thank you to you all. We so appreciate your expertise and your work and your continued work on this important topic. Before we conclude, I do want to share with everyone on a more, I don't know if it's more positive or not, but I want to share our winners of the plastic pollution contest. And let me get that up here. We selected 2 winners, and the first is from Eduardo from Veracruz, Mexico, who took photos of grebes who are using blocks of styrofoam in ponds, accompanied by others of its kind, trying to rest in an artificial shelter that shows how humans have taken over. That's what he writes. Although the image seems peaceful, the plastic breaks the natural harmony and reveals a harsh reality. Even protected birds, such as this wild jewel of our waters, can no longer find rest far from the footprint of our trash. The photograph was taken at Laguna de Chirimoyo in Orizaba, Veracruz, a wetland struggling to maintain its balance, now transformed into a regulating reservoir, reflecting how human intervention profoundly alters ecosystems. So a beautiful but illustrative photo of the impacts of plastics on this bird. And our second award went to Dr. Jennifer Lavers of Tasmania, Australia. And she writes that in Northern Australia, 100% of great bowerbirds' bowers contain substantial plastic pollution, often over 250 pieces in a single bower. The male bowerbirds collect and use plastic items as colorful bower decorations, as this can help them attract a mate. Unfortunately, this can often include ribbon and other plastic items that can entangle birds. And I do want to mention that while we focused a bit on the marine impacts of plastic pollution, there are also many inland impacts. So we need to consider it wherever you live. It's not just an ocean problem. It's an issue wherever birds are and where plastics are. So again, thank you so much to everyone. We will continue again in September with our Dark Skies and Birds webinar, and hope you'll join us for another insightful and impactful webinar. We appreciate your participation, and more so, you're taking it out to your communities and sharing these words and ways that we can help birds. So thank you very much. We'll see you in September, and thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you, Susan.